Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the world you knew had vanished. The roads that once carried merchants across continents are empty. Great cities that stood proudly for centuries are burning. Palaces lie abandoned. Kingdoms that ruled millions simply disappear from history. For the people living around the Mediterranean more than 3,000 years ago, this was not fiction. It was reality. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the world you knew had vanished. The roads that once carried merchants across continents are empty. Great cities that stood proudly for centuries are burning. Palaces lie abandoned. Kingdoms that ruled millions simply disappear from history. For the people living around the Mediterranean more than 3,000 years ago, this was not fiction. It was reality. For centuries, people believed civilizations rose and fell one at a time. An empire weakened. Another replaced it. History moved forward. But the Bronze Age collapse was different. It was as if the foundations of civilization itself suddenly cracked. Cities burned across thousands of kilometers. Kings disappeared from history. Writing systems were forgotten. Entire cultures faded into silence. Some regions would not recover for hundreds of years. Imagine if every major country in today's world collapsed within a single generation. Governments vanished. Trade stopped. Technology disappeared. Knowledge was lost. That comparison comes surprisingly close to what happened over 3,000 years ago. Yet this story is not only about destruction. It is also about resilience. About the people who survived. About civilizations that adapted. And about how one of the darkest chapters in human history eventually gave birth to a completely new world. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. One of history's greatest mysteries. And perhaps the closest humanity has ever come to losing civilization itself. Long before cities fell into ruin and empires disappeared, the Bronze Age was one of the greatest periods of prosperity the world had ever known. Across the eastern Mediterranean, powerful kingdoms traded goods, exchanged ideas, and maintained diplomatic relationships that stretched across thousands of miles. It was an age of innovation. An age of wealth. An age when some believed civilization had reached its highest point. No one could imagine that this golden world was only decades away from collapse. The Mediterranean was more than a sea. It was the highway of the ancient world. Ships loaded with copper from Cyprus crossed its waters. Tin traveled from distant lands, making the production of bronze possible. Gold arrived from Egypt. Ivory came from Africa. Fine pottery moved between kingdoms. Luxury fabrics, spices, precious stones, and handcrafted weapons passed from one port to another. For the first time in history, civilizations were deeply connected through international trade. Among the greatest powers stood Egypt. Under the rule of mighty pharaohs, enormous temples rose along the Nile. Massive statues guarded sacred cities. Thousands of skilled workers built monuments that still amaze the modern world. The Nile flooded each year, bringing fertile soil that allowed millions of people to thrive. Egypt was wealthy, stable, and immensely powerful. Yet even this ancient superpower would soon face one of the greatest challenges in its history. North of Egypt lay another giant, the Hittite Empire. Its capital, Hattusa, was surrounded by enormous stone walls stretching for miles. Inside its gates stood royal palaces, temples, archives, and workshops. The Hittites mastered ironworking long before most of their rivals. They fielded powerful armies equipped with fast chariots and disciplined soldiers. For centuries, they rivaled Egypt itself. The two empires even fought one of history's most famous battles, the Battle of Kadesh. Eventually, they signed one of the earliest known peace treaties ever recorded. It seemed that two superpowers had found a lasting balance. Across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean kingdoms flourished. Massive fortresses crowned rocky hills. Warrior kings ruled from magnificent palaces filled with treasures of gold. Skilled craftsmen created elegant jewelry, painted pottery, and finely crafted weapons. Merchants traveled freely between islands and distant kingdoms. The Mycenaeans became masters of both trade and warfare. Their influence spread across the Mediterranean. Many historians believe these kingdoms later inspired the legends recorded by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Looking across the ancient world, everything appeared connected. Kings exchanged letters. Merchants crossed the seas. Diplomats negotiated peace. Bronze flowed through vast trade networks that linked continents. To those living at the time, the future must have seemed secure. But beneath this prosperity, hidden weaknesses were beginning to grow. And soon, a series of events would trigger one of the greatest collapses civilization had ever experienced. History rarely changes in a single day. Great civilizations do not usually vanish overnight. Their decline often begins quietly. Almost unnoticed. A failed harvest. A delayed shipment. A border conflict that seems insignificant at the time. For generations, the kingdoms of the Bronze Age had relied on one another. Their economies were connected by trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, and luxury goods from every corner of the known world moved constantly between ports and cities. It was an extraordinary network. But it was also fragile. Like a chain, it was only as strong as its weakest link. Around the late 13th century BC, cracks began to appear. Archaeological evidence suggests that several regions experienced long periods of drought. Less rainfall meant poor harvests. Poor harvests meant hunger. As food became scarce, prices rose. Communities struggled to feed themselves. Families abandoned farms that had been cultivated for generations. For ordinary people, survival became more important than loyalty to kings. Even the strongest kingdoms depended on stable food supplies. Without them, everything else began to fail. Nature may have delivered another devastating blow. The eastern Mediterranean sits in one of the world's most active seismic zones. Evidence from multiple archaeological sites suggests that powerful earthquakes struck several cities within a relatively short period. Walls collapsed. Palaces cracked apart. Temples that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Some historians call this the earthquake storm, a sequence of major earthquakes that may have weakened civilizations just before the final collapse. Although the theory remains debated, the destruction uncovered by archaeologists is impossible to ignore. As cities struggled to recover, violence spread. Trade routes became increasingly dangerous. Merchants disappeared. Caravans were attacked. Pirates targeted ships carrying valuable cargo across the Mediterranean. Without secure trade, bronze itself became difficult to produce. Remember, bronze required two essential metals: copper and tin, often mined hundreds or even thousands of miles apart. If just one shipment failed to arrive, entire workshops could fall silent. Weapons could no longer be forged. Tools became scarce. The economy that had supported civilizations for centuries began to unravel. At the same time, kingdoms faced growing unrest from within. Heavy taxes placed increasing pressure on ordinary people. Food shortages led to protests and migration. Some local rulers challenged their kings. Others simply abandoned their cities. Royal authority weakened. In letters preserved on clay tablets, desperate rulers pleaded for assistance. They requested grain, military support, anything that could prevent disaster. Many never received a reply. No single disaster brought down the Bronze Age. Instead, crisis followed crisis. Drought, earthquakes, economic collapse, political instability, violence. Each problem made the next one even worse. Civilizations that had seemed invincible were becoming increasingly fragile. And then, from across the sea, came a new threat. A mysterious force that would become one of history's greatest enigmas. The Sea Peoples. Who they were. Where they came from. And why they appeared at exactly the right moment to change history. Remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Imagine standing on the coast of ancient Egypt. The sea is calm. Fishing boats drift gently across the water. Merchants unload cargo from distant kingdoms. Life appears peaceful. Then, on the horizon, dark shapes begin to emerge. At first, they seem like ordinary ships. But there are too many. As they draw closer, the sails become visible. Then the warriors. Entire families travel with them. Men carrying swords and spears. Women. Children. Ox-drawn carts loaded with everything they own. This is not a simple army. It is an entire population on the move. Within only a few years, these mysterious people would appear across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities would burn. Kingdoms would disappear. And history would remember them by a single name. The Sea Peoples. Who were the Sea Peoples? The truth is, no one knows for certain. Unlike the Egyptians or the Hittites, they left behind almost no written records of their own. Everything we know comes from the people who fought against them. Egyptian inscriptions mention several different groups. Names like the Shurden, the Pele-Set, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, the Jeker. Whether these were separate nations, allied tribes, or simply different names used by Egyptian scribes remains a matter of debate. Even today, archaeologists continue searching for answers. Some historians believe the Sea Peoples came from the Aegean world. Others suggest Western Anatolia. Some point toward Cyprus. Others believe they were made up of many different peoples brought together by famine, climate change, and political collapse. Perhaps they were not invaders in the traditional sense. Perhaps they were refugees. Entire communities searching for new land after their own homes had become impossible to live in. If true, then they were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were another consequence of it. The greatest evidence comes from Egypt. During the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples launched a massive invasion. By then, they had already destroyed or weakened several kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean. Now they were approaching the richest kingdom of all. Ramesses understood that defeating them on land alone would not be enough. He prepared an ambush. Egyptian archers lined the riverbanks. Warships waited in hidden positions. When the invading fleet entered the Nile Delta, the Egyptians struck with overwhelming force. Arrows filled the sky. Enemy ships became trapped. The battle was fierce. But Egypt survived. Egypt celebrated its victory. The walls of Medinet Habu still tell the story. Massive stone carvings show defeated enemies. Captured ships. Prisoners. And triumphant Egyptian soldiers. Yet behind the victory lay a troubling reality. Egypt had survived. But the world around it had not. The Hittite Empire was gone. The Mycenaean kingdoms had collapsed. Ugarit had been destroyed. Trade routes had vanished. Even Egypt itself entered a long period of decline. Winning one battle could not restore an entire civilization. For centuries, the Sea Peoples became the face of the Bronze Age collapse. But modern archaeology tells a more complicated story. No evidence suggests they destroyed every kingdom. Many cities had already begun to weaken before they arrived. Climate change. Famine. Political instability. Economic collapse. Earthquakes. Civil war. The Sea Peoples may have delivered the final blow. But the ancient world was already beginning to fall apart. For generations, historians searched for a single answer. One invasion. One earthquake. One great famine. One catastrophe powerful enough to explain why so many civilizations disappeared within such a short period of time. But the more archaeologists uncovered, the more complicated the story became. Today, most researchers believe there was no single cause. Instead, the Bronze Age collapse was the result of many crises happening at once. Each one weakened the ancient world. Together, they overwhelmed it. Climate change is now considered one of the strongest explanations. Scientific studies of pollen, tree rings, lake sediments, and cave formations reveal that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced decades of unusually dry conditions. Less rain meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant hunger. Hunger led to migration, conflict, and political instability. For societies that depended on predictable agriculture, even a few years of drought could trigger a chain reaction. A generation of poor harvests could threaten an entire civilization. At the same time, Bronze Age civilizations had become deeply interconnected. This brought enormous prosperity. But it also created hidden risks. Imagine a modern economy where factories depend on parts made thousands of miles away. If shipping stops, production stops. The Bronze Age worked in much the same way. Copper came from one region. Tin from another. Grain from Egypt. Timber from Lebanon. Luxury goods from distant kingdoms. When one link in the chain broke, the effects spread everywhere. This is what scholars call systemic collapse. There was another unexpected consequence. As bronze became increasingly difficult to produce, people began searching for alternatives. Iron had long been known. But it was difficult to work with. Over time, blacksmiths learned to forge stronger iron tools and weapons. The Age of Bronze slowly gave way to the Iron Age. New kingdoms emerged. New armies formed. New technologies spread across the ancient world. Out of collapse came transformation. Some civilizations disappeared forever. Others adapted. The Phoenicians expanded their maritime trade and established colonies across the Mediterranean. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah rose during the centuries that followed. In Greece, the collapse eventually gave way to a remarkable cultural rebirth. Centuries later, philosophers, scientists, artists, and democratic institutions would emerge from this transformed world. The end of one age became the beginning of another. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's greatest mysteries. We may never know every detail. New discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. Every excavation. Every inscription. Every fragment of pottery. Every ancient letter. Adds another small piece to a puzzle more than 3,000 years old. History is rarely simple. And perhaps that is what makes it so fascinating. 3,000 years ago, people watched their world disappear. Cities burned. Empires fell. Trade collapsed. Knowledge was lost. And for a time, it must have seemed that civilization itself had come to an end. Yet humanity endured. Communities rebuilt. New kingdoms rose from the ruins. New ideas replaced old traditions. History moved forward. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that even the greatest civilizations are not invincible. But it also reminds us of something equally important. Human resilience can outlast even the darkest chapter in history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient world, don't forget to subscribe to History of the World for more documentaries exploring the greatest stories ever told.